This story took place about 10 years ago. I grew up in a modest house, and for most of my childhood, I shared a bedroom with my older brother. 2 twin beds on opposite sides of the room, 2 dressers and 2 closets. We didn't even have space for a desk. It wasn't cramped, but it sure wasn't comfortable. So when my brother left for college, I wasted no time moving his bed out of the room and claiming the space. With his blessing, of course. At last I was old enough to need a desk in my room. No more doing homework in the basement or in my dad's office upstairs. That setup worked perfectly for the 2 years before I left for college myself. And by that point, I wasn't living at home anymore, so it didn't really matter. After graduation, my brother landed a city job in the area, so he moved back into my parents' house. The first thing he did, yep, you guessed it, was reset our bedroom to how it had been before I changed it. I was a little annoyed at first, but my parents pointed out that I had essentially done the same thing to him, so it was only fair. I couldn't argue with that, so I let it go. By the time I graduated, I had found a city job as well, so I decided to move back in with my parents just like my brother had. The only issue? There was no room left for me. I had to find another solution. The only spare room in the house was the upstairs guest bedroom, so even though it was half the size of my old room, I had no choice but to make do. This guest room was right next to my dad's office, which was the only other room on that floor. It was also directly above the garage, so every time someone hit the garage door opener, the whole floor would shake for the entire 10 seconds it took the door to open. The room jutted out slightly over He House since it was at the corner, with 2 windows on adjacent walls, one looking out over the driveway, and the other facing the side of the house. It wasn't perfect, but it was private and quiet most of the time. Now, this particular incident happened on a Friday evening when I was home alone. My brother was off in Baltimore for a work conference, and my parents were spending the weekend at our family shore house, like they often did during the summer. After an absolutely exhausting day at work, I decided to skip going out with friends or leaving the house altogether. I just wanted to order some food and call it an early night. It was around 11:30 p.m., and I was lying in bed reading a book, trying to wind down from the day. The house was completely silent, which was a welcome change since it was usually pretty noisy when everyone was home. That's when I heard the unmistakable sound of the garage door starting to rise, followed by that familiar vibration of the floor, a sensation I had grown accustomed to over the past few months. It took a few seconds for the realization to hit me. None of my family members were supposed to be home. My parents had specifically said they were staying at the shore house until Sunday, and my brother wasn't supposed to return until Saturday afternoon. It took several moments for that thought to fully register, but when it did, my heart started pounding. I quickly jumped out of bed and looked out the window toward the driveway, but it was so dark that I couldn't make out anything clearly. I could see that the garage door was open, but I couldn't make out if there was a car inside or who might have opened it. Without wasting any more time, I dug through the closet until I found one of the baseball bats my parents had tossed in, there from my childhood. As I crept down the stairs, I tried to convince myself that there had to be a reasonable explanation for the garage door being open. Maybe my parents had forgotten something and came back. Maybe my brother's plans changed. Hell, maybe the door had glitched and opened on its own. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, just before turning the corner toward the main part of the house, I heard faint voices. They were definitely coming from the other side of the house where the bedrooms were. The voices were too muffled for me to make out what they were saying, but I could tell there were at least 2 people talking. That's when it hit me. Someone had broken into the house. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911, whispering my address and telling the operator that my house was being burglarized. I kept the line open and slipped the phone back into my pocket, just like they tell you to do. The operator told me to stay where I was and not to announce my presence, but a wave of urgency swept over me. I felt this uncontrollable need to defend my home, as though some invisible force was pushing me to do something, anything rather, than just hide and wait. So ignoring the operator's advice, I decided I was going to take action. I crept down the hallway toward the voices, gripping the baseball bat as tightly as I could. As I got closer to my parents' bedroom, I could hear the unmistakable sound of drawers opening and things being shuffled around. They were clearly looking for something valuable. I took a deep breath, knowing what I was about to do was probably reckless, but I couldn't stop myself. I yelled as loudly as I could to catch them off guard, then charged into the room with the bat raised over my head. There were two men rummaging through my mother's closet, and they both let out startled shouts when I barged in. I could tell they hadn't expected anyone to be home, let alone someone who was willing to fight back. That gave me a strange confidence, even though I was outnumbered, and they could easily have weapons of their own. I swung the bat at the closer of the two men, hitting his leg with a solid thud. He cursed and staggered a few steps before collapsing. I turned to face the other one, but before I could swing again, he dropped his shoulder and tackled me before I had a chance to react. The impact was jarring as we hit the floor hard, and I immediately realized this guy was much bigger and stronger than me. He wrestled the bat out of my hands effortlessly, then grabbed me by the throat and began choking me. I fought with everything I had, clawing at his hands, trying to pry them off me when I noticed the first guy crawling toward us. He had something in his hand that looked like a knife. In that moment, it hit me. I had made a massive mistake by trying to play hero, a mistake that might very well cost me my life. I genuinely thought those could be my last moments. I started to accept that I was going to die in my parents' bedroom. All I could think about was how devastated my mom would be when she found out. But then, in the distance, I heard the faint sound of police sirens getting closer. The last thing I remember is the second guy picking up my baseball bat and swinging it at my head. After that, everything went black. When I woke up, someone was gently shaking me. I blinked my eyes open and saw a police officer kneeling beside me, asking if I was okay. I was dazed, struggling to piece everything together, and it took me a few seconds to recall what had just happened. I glanced around the room and noticed that the door leading from my parents' bedroom to the backyard was wide open. The intruders had clearly knocked me out and escaped through the back as soon as they heard the sirens. The officer told me to stay still, not to move too much in case I had a concussion or other injuries. My head was throbbing, but I was conscious and coherent, which seemed like a positive sign. After the paramedics confirmed that I was all right, I refused to go to the hospital, even though they strongly recommended it. I gave the officers a detailed account of the night's events, and they informed me that they were currently searching the neighborhood for any suspects. Unfortunately, by the time they arrived, the men were long gone. Once the police finished their investigation and took photos of the scene, I called my parents and brother to let them know what had happened. My parents scolded me pretty severely for being reckless enough to confront the intruders, and I couldn't argue. Had I just hidden like I should have, there was a chance the police could have caught them, but the men were never found, despite the police canvassing the neighborhood and chasing down a few leads. As soon as my parents returned from the shore house, they installed a top-of-the-line security system, complete with cameras, motion detectors, lights, everything. But even after everything was in place, something about the whole incident kept gnawing at me. All the doors to the house had been locked that night, and the only way to open the garage door was through a small button in my car, which my dad had programmed as a wireless switch. There was no way someone would have just stumbled upon it. Whoever had broken in that night had to have known us or our house well enough to know exactly where that button was. What bothered me even more was that I never locked my car when it was in the driveway. So the intruders must have known that too, and the timing. How did they know my parents would be away for the weekend? And my brother would be out of town? I don't live in that house anymore, but my parents were never able to find out who had broken in. It haunted my dad for a long time, especially since he believed that whoever did it had to be someone close to the family. I'm not going to claim that night changed me forever, or anything cliche like that, but I will say this. Life before and after you've accepted that you're going to die is a whole different experience. I can still recall that feeling of thinking I was at the end of the line. It felt so dissociative. There's nothing in this world that can replicate that feeling. This happened about 6 months ago, and I'm still shaken by how calculated and personal the entire situation was. I had recently moved back to my hometown to help care for my aging mother, who lives about 20 minutes away. I found a small duplex that was perfect for my circumstances, close enough to be there quickly if she needed me, but far enough to give me my own space and independence. My mom has been dealing with some health issues lately. Nothing life-threatening, but she's had a few minor falls around the house, and she's stubborn about accepting help. I've been trying to convince her to get one of those medical alert systems But she insists she doesn't need one and says I'm just being overprotective. It's been a constant source of stress for me, especially knowing that she's alone most of the time. On this particular evening, I was just settling in for the night. It was around 9 p.m., and I was lounging on the couch watching TV when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a local number I didn't recognize, but since I was still getting used to the area, I figured it might be important and decided to answer. The woman on the other end identified herself as a nurse at a nearby emergency room. She told me my mother had been brought in about an hour ago after a fall, where she hit her head. According to her, my mom was conscious but asking for me, and they needed to know if I could get to the hospital quickly. I was horrified. This was the kind of call I'd been dreading since moving back. I didn't question the call's authenticity for a second. The woman knew my mother's full name, her address, and even mentioned her recent hip replacement surgery from a few months ago. I immediately stopped everything I was doing, trying to stay calm and level-headed, muttering a silent prayer. I didn't even think to lock up the house. I just grabbed my keys, slammed the front door shut, and rushed to my car. The drive to the hospital was a nightmare. I kept running through different scenarios in my mind, and none of them seemed good. When I got to the ER, I hurried to the reception desk and told them I was there for my mother. I gave them her name and said I'd received a call about her fall. The nurse looked at me confused and checked the computer. She then told me there was no record of anyone by that name being admitted or treated that evening. I insisted there had to be a mistake, that I had just gotten a call from someone claiming to be a nurse there. The receptionist was sympathetic but firm. They had no record of my mom being brought in and suggested I try calling her directly to make sure she was okay. So that's exactly what I did. I stepped outside and called my mom's landline, and she picked up. She said she'd been sleeping and asked why I was calling so late. I didn't want to scare her, so I just said I was checking in on her and told her to go back to bed. And that's when the heart-sinking realization hit me. This had been a setup. Someone had deliberately fed me false information to get me out of my house. I jumped back in my car, furious at how easily I had been tricked. When I pulled into my driveway, the front door was still shut exactly as I had left it. For a moment, I wondered if I was just being paranoid, and maybe nothing had happened at all. But the second I stepped inside, I knew. I'd been robbed. The house had been completely ransacked. My TV was gone, along with my laptop and the small jewelry collection I kept in my bedroom. But as I looked around more carefully, I realized the thieves had taken some truly strange things too. Family photos had been removed from their frames. Not the frames themselves, just the photos. My prescription bottles from the bathroom medicine cabinet had been emptied and taken. It was insane. They'd stolen things with little monetary value but enormous sentimental worth. It felt like some twisted act of cruelty. I'm telling you, there's no reason a thief would ever take family photos. There just isn't. I called the police immediately, though by that point I already felt defeated. Deep down, I knew the thieves were long gone, and there was nothing I could do about it. I recounted everything to the officers. I remembered the phone call word for word, and after hearing it, they came to the same conclusion I had. Whoever was on the other end knew things about my mother and me that no stranger could have possibly known. For the life of me, I couldn't think of a single person who would have had that kind of information, or how anyone could have gotten it. The officers told me to reach out again if anything concrete came up. Then they left. I was utterly baffled. Imagine how unnerving it would be if a complete stranger knew enough about you to get you to leave your house. The theft itself was terrible, but the fact that they targeted family photos and medical details made it clear this wasn't about quick cash. It felt personal. I couldn't shake the feeling they were planning something more long-term, maybe identity, theft, or some other scheme that required access to personal information. But over the next few weeks, nothing else happened. Even though my mother can't remember who she might have talked to about her personal information, I'm pretty sure she's the source of the leak. She surprisingly has a lot of friends for a woman her age. And knowing her, she probably shared too much with the wrong person. I've warned her about this, and she's finally agreed to be more cautious about who she gives her personal details to. Still, I can't shake the feeling that we're being watched by someone who knows way too much about our lives and isn't done with whatever they're planning. Either way, I've recently installed a Ring camera, so hopefully that'll be enough to deter anyone else. If anything else happens, I'll update you. So that's exactly what I did. I stepped outside and dialed my mom's landline. When she picked up, she sounded groggy and asked why I was calling so late. I didn't want to alarm her, so I casually told her I was just checking in and urged her to go back to sleep. And then it hit me like a punch to the gut. This had all been a setup. Someone had deliberately fed me false information to lure me out of my house. I'm a single guy in my early 30s, living alone in a rented house that I've been calling home for over a year now. It's a cozy little place in a quiet neighborhood. Nothing extravagant, but comfortable, and the rent's reasonable. I've settled into a solid routine here, and it really feels like I've made it my own. The incident happened on a Thursday night. Around 11, I was getting ready for bed when I suddenly heard aggressive pounding on my front door. Not just knocking, but actual pounding, like someone was trying to break it down. I glanced out the window, but the porch light's poor positioning made it hard to see anything clearly, even though I couldn't make out who it was. And the knocking was so intense, I wasn't scared. I'm a pretty buff guy, so I wasn't afraid. More than anything, I was just irritated and confused. I opened the front door, careful to keep the screen door shut for some added protection. I'm not sure what I was expecting, but what I saw definitely threw me off. Standing there was this extremely agitated man, maybe a few years older than me. He was of average height, his hair was disheveled, and he was dressed in clothes that looked like they'd been slept in for several nights in a row. But what really caught my attention was how angry and unstable he seemed. His eyes were darting around, and he was breathing heavily, like he'd been running or was on the verge of a panic attack. He was pacing, almost like he couldn't keep still. Before I could even ask him what he wanted, he started yelling that this was his house and demanding that I let him in. He said I was trespassing and that he would call the police if I didn't leave immediately. I figured he was either on drugs, having some kind of mental health crisis, or maybe a mix of both. I tried to calm him down, explaining that he had the wrong house, but it only made him more agitated. That's when he started rattling off details about the house that made me freeze. I don't remember everything he said, but he knew several things about the house that couldn't have been seen from the outside. Details that only someone who had actually lived there would know. For instance, he knew that the door to the master bedroom was poorly designed and would bang into the toilet. He also knew that the back door sticks, and you have to lift it slightly while turning the doorknob. There were other details too, but honestly, I can't recall them all. I don't even think I said anything while he was talking. I just stood there, stunned and speechless. But that wasn't the strangest part. It was about to get much, much weirder. Through the screen door, he pulled out a folder and started showing me documents. He had what looked like a lease agreement, his name on it, dated 6 months before I'd even moved in. He had pieces of mail addressed to him at this address. Everything looked official, though I couldn't shake the feeling it had been forged somehow. But the most unsettling part came when he pulled out his phone and started showing me photos. They were actual pictures of him inside my house, sitting on my couch, watching TV, cooking in the kitchen, even lying down in what is now my bedroom. The photos looked recent and they seemed completely legitimate. They weren't obviously edited or staged, and most of them weren't even solo shots. There were other people in them, people I'd never seen before. One photo in particular stood out. It was from this past 4th of July, just a few months ago. He said it was a selfie taken by a woman I didn't recognize. In the picture, the woman, him, and a few other people were all smiling at the camera from the kitchen table. There was a box of fireworks off to the side, and the details in the picture made it look completely authentic. That's when I really started questioning my own memory and sanity. How could this person have all this evidence if he'd never lived here? I began wondering if somehow I had blocked out memories of sharing the house with someone, if I was the one having some kind of psychological breakdown. It was terrifying, especially since I knew for a fact I had been home on the 4th of July, which made the photos even more perplexing. The entire situation was so surreal that I told him I was going to call the police to sort it out. Not in an antagonistic way, but because I honestly didn't know what else to do. I thought they could check the records and figure out what was going on. But as soon as I mentioned calling the cops, the guy's demeanor shifted entirely. He became strangely calm and said he'd wait outside while I made the call. Then he simply walked away from the door and disappeared into the night. I watched from the window, but I couldn't see where he went. About 10 minutes later, the police arrived. I explained the entire bizarre situation to them. They suggested I reach out to my landlord to contact the previous tenants, thinking I might get some answers that way. I had all the necessary documentation proving I was renting the house, but when I offered to show it to them, they waved it off. They said the man on my doorstep was probably just having a mental episode and that, as long as he was gone, I should go back to my normal life. Then they left. But I wasn't about to sit back and accept that. Whether or not the guy had left, I was still stuck with the question of how he had all that evidence. With the help of my landlord, I was eventually able to get in touch with the previous tenants. I should note that my landlord had no clue about what had happened. He didn't recognize the man's description and confirmed he had never rented to anyone like that. Anyway, the old tenants also had no idea who I was talking about. They said they had lived in the house alone for 3 years before moving out and didn't know anyone, matching the man's description. They were just as baffled as I was about how this stranger could have such intimate knowledge of the house and apparently legitimate photos of himself inside of it. For the next 2 weeks, I was constantly on edge, but nothing else happened, and I started to convince myself that maybe it had just been some elaborate scam that had failed. But of course, that turned out to be mostly wishful thinking. One night, after a fun evening out with my friends, I came home to find my house completely ransacked. It wasn't like a typical burglary where someone grabs obvious valuables and runs. No, the place was completely torn apart, like someone had been looking for something specific. What that something was, I had no idea. The most bizarre part was that most of my electronics and other valuables were still there, despite the fact that the rooms they were in had been trashed. The police found no signs of forced entry, which suggested that whoever had done it had a copy of my key. Given the timing and the strange incident 2 weeks earlier, it seemed all but certain that the same person was responsible. After that, the police took things more seriously, and so did my landlord. He replaced all the locks immediately, free of charge, and also installed extra security measures. The prevailing theory, and the one I believe, is that some delusional person really does think he lives in my house and broke in to look for his personal belongings or something. And yeah, that's disturbing enough on its own. But it doesn't even begin to explain how he had all that documentation, or how he had literal copies of my house key. I wish I'd had the presence of mind to take a closer look at that so-called lease agreement he showed me, because maybe I could have gotten his name. But in the moment, I just wasn't thinking clearly. The documents don't even bother me that much. Those could have easily been forged or altered, including the alleged pieces of mail. What really chills me to my core, though, are the photos. I have no explanation for any of them. Maybe they're just old pictures with doctored dates. But even if that's the case, it still doesn't explain why my landlord, who's owned that house his entire life, didn't recognize him. One of my friends suggested that maybe I'm up against something not fully natural. I don't believe in that kind of stuff, but I will say this. There's been this constant creepy feeling hanging over me whenever I'm in my own home, which is most of the time. I can't even begin to rationalize any of it. I just hope that's the end of it.